Good evening all. Welcome to a Tuesday night of Endodontics and my thoughts. I'm going to be talking to you today or this evening about Ledermix and some other things which will make your life easier, I think. But before we do, we need to have an introduction, which I'm about to play.
Tonight's speaker is Associate Professor Peter Duckmanton. Associate Professor Peter Duckmanton has been until recently the Senior Clinical Specialist in Endodontics at Sydney Dental Hospital and Adjunctive Associate Professor with the Faculty of Dentistry, where he has taught endodontics for over 25 years. He has previously been the Federal President of the Australian Society of Endodontology, as well as the State President and Secretary Treasurer of the New South Wales branch of the ASE. He holds a fellowship from the Royal Australasian College of Dental Surgeons, the International College of Dentists, and the Pierre Fauchard Academy, and is a Federal Counsellor of the Royal Australasian College of Dental Surgeons. Peter is on the review panels of the International Endodontic Journal, the Australian Endodontic Journal, Dental Traumatology, and Special Care in Dentistry. Peter was a major organising force for the first and second Trans-Tasman Endodontic Conferences. He has lectured and given hands-on courses throughout Australia, New Zealand, the UK and Sweden. Peter has most recently been involved with epidemiological studies on endodontics in various Australian populations. Since 2008, he has been an honours supervisor for 35 Bachelor of Dentistry students at the University of Sydney. Peter has run the very successful endodontic elective program for Sydney Dental School students for over a decade. Please welcome Professor Peter Duckmanton.
So I'm going to be talking about all these things this evening, and there's a fair bit there. So you obviously won't get much about anything, but don't be too concerned because all these slides are available to you or will be available to you, and you can go through them. And if you have any questions, you can ask them at the end of tonight's session, or you can send them in, the ones we don't get to, and we'll get them answered for you at a later date. Obviously, I have to tell you I'm being paid tonight to give this presentation, but I also like to say that I use almost every material or technique I am very briefly discussing. I'm going to be focusing on canal medications, and we'll focus on Ledermix and calcium hydroxide. I'm just focusing on these as these are the only two I use. I'm going to be talking about Ledermix paste, not Ledermix cement. And I've got to say that the majority of this presentation is from that of Professor Paul Abbott AO, who has very kindly lent me his slides, which I've modified slightly. So first of all, we have to ask, why do we use medicaments? Well, we use them for their antibacterial action against residual bacteria in canals, tubules, fins, etc. We want them to reduce recontamination between visits if our temporaries happen to fail, and I'll show you hopefully why that shouldn't happen. We want them to have an antibacterial action in the periapical and the periodontal tissues. We want them to reduce periapical inflammation, to prevent or reduce pain, to stimulate periapical repair, and to prevent or inhibit inflammatory resorption. Paul Abbott, who normally would give this presentation but is having a bit of a rest at present, I assume, because I'm not too sure why I'm giving it, but Paul, I'm doing it for Paul. But that's very nice of AusDent to invite me. Paul's written some rather good articles. You may think they're a little bit old now, but they're still oldies but goodies. And here are some references for you. Have a look at these. I'm going to be talking about endodontic medicaments. As I said, the major functions and choices we're going to be looking at: anti-inflammatory Ledermix paste, and perhaps odonto paste, I should add in there, antibacterial paste, Ledermix paste, and calcium hydroxide. Functions such as stimulating hard tissue repair. At one stage that would have been calcium hydroxide, but now it could also be hydraulic calcium silicate cements, materials such as biodentine and MTA. Let's just start with a bit of history. Ledermix paste and cement has been commercially available since 1962. So we've had 58 years of clinical research and use, developed by Dr. Andre Schroeder, who is a Swiss dentist. We've had clinical and histological studies done for pulpitis. Here are some references. Initially, hydrocortisone was used, and then triamcinolone, which is a more potent corticosteroid. This has been combined with chloramphenicol and xylocaine originally in an ointment base, but that no longer happens. In 62, Schroeder changed his own formulation to remove xylocaine. 62, Ledermix was made available commercially, and the antibiotic component was changed to declomethylcycline. This was just purely done for commercial reasons, not for any other biological reason, I don't think. But Ledermix has always been controversial in some parts of the world, particularly the United States. Also, my colleagues in the UK often ask me why I use it, or why I did use it, because I'm not using it too much at present. Some of the concerns people had were the systemic or possible systemic side effects of steroids, the inability of steroids to stimulate calcific repair, the fact that steroids might lead to chronic inflammation and or pulp necrosis, the development of tetracycline-resistant microorganisms, the development of hypersensitivity reactions to tetracyclines, and the fact that perhaps there are more specific antimicrobial agents that might be more useful. It has been claimed that Ledermix is banned in the United States. This is false news. This is just not true. If you look at Schroeder's actual textbook, which I have a copy of, it's mentioned here that everywhere else in the world, except basically the United States, Ledermix paste is quite commonly used. But the truth is about Ledermix in the United States, it's never been submitted to the Federal Drugs Administration for approval. And that's basically just a financial reason, nothing else. Ledermix was such a small part of their potpourri that it wasn't worth them investing in the money to have it done for such what was perceived to be a very small market. But are there systemic side effects of steroids? Well, Paul Abbott once again published in the IEJ many years ago now on the fact that the steroids released from Ledermix do not have any potential systemic side effects, and was much less when compared to endogenous steroids in humans, those of us who are in normal situations and under stress, probably like I am at the moment. I'm probably pumping out a few steroids. I could do with them, of course. So is the development of tetracycline-resistant microorganisms a possibility? There have been no reports in the literature after 57 years of use throughout many countries in the world. But I would suggest here that with Ledermix, you do not want to rely on just one medicament, and I'll be talking about dual medicaments in a little while. The recommendations are that we would use calcium hydroxide as a subsequent dressing in all infected root canals before placing the final root canal filling. That's certainly a Australian and New Zealand idea. Some parts of the UK and Europe as well. In the United States, it's not particularly common. If Ledermix is used initially, remember it's only going to be active for 4 days, and then you basically have an empty canal. So you do need to have something else in there to fill that space. Calcium hydroxide has a much broader antibacterial spectrum activity, and hopefully will destroy any remaining bacteria. So if there is any regrowth in the canal, calcium hydroxide should counteract it. So question the development of hypersensitivity reactions to tetracyclines. Allergy to tetracyclines is extremely rare. There's been only 2 cases reported over the last 58 years. One, a letter to the editor of the British Journal in 2013, where there was very little detail given, and then a case report in the IEJ from 2014, which Professor Paul Abbott was also involved with. And this confirmed a tetracycline allergy via skin tests. The patient recovered when Ledermix was removed from the tooth. What's in Ledermix paste? Triamcinolone and declomethylcycline. It's in a water-soluble paste, and here's what else is in it. It used to be made overseas, it's now made in Australia. If we compare odontopaste, it's a clindamycin hydrochloride, which is an antibiotic, and triamcinolone, which is the steroid-based anti-inflammatory, and which acts through direct contact with the inflamed tissue. Also, as in Ledermix, there's zinc oxide and other ingredients. Are there many articles on odontopaste around? Yes, well, when I had a quick look earlier on last month, I found lucky 13. One of which was talking about odontopaste as a pain reliever from some researchers in Iran. And this was an interesting paper because they compared odontopaste with their own homemade odontopaste and other medicament. And they found that the odontopaste and their own homemade odontopaste, which had the identical ingredients, results in a significant reduction in postoperative pain and percussion sensitivity after 24 hours. But there was no statistical significance difference after 7 days with the placebo. Wouldn't you like to be in the placebo group? Down the bottom of the slide, you can see what was in the both components. So as we said, the Ledermix story, the concerns were we had these problems with systemic side effects, the inability of steroids to stimulate calcific repair, steroids leading to chronic inflammation and pulp necrosis, development of tetracycline microorganisms, development of hypersensitivity reactions to tetracyclines, and more specific antimicrobial agents may be available. But these concerns aren't valid in my opinion. Ledermix diffuses through dentine, and here's some articles looking at that from a group in Adelaide, once again published quite some time ago, but these are interesting articles, and they will show us that Ledermix paste diffuses through dentine and cementum periapically as well. And even though that we were looking in nanomolar ranges of the drug diffusing, it was certainly sufficient for an anti-inflammatory action. Also, when we had a look at I found another few articles, once again by Paul Abbott-Hume and Jeffrey Heathersay, talking about how rapidly the molecules diffuse through dentine, and they reached their peak diffusion rate at 2 hours, and then it decreased. So this was actually talking about a pulp capping agent, but I think you'll find that the diffusion rates would still be the same. Here's a further study looking at what stops Ledermix from diffusing, and this study, also by the same group, demonstrated that neither smear layer nor cementum were complete barriers to diffusion. The data obtained appeared to be of clinical relevance and provided further understanding of the dynamics of drugs in root canals. And those of us who use Ledermix know that it is really quite effective. Here's a study done in Melbourne by Effie Ehrman, Harold Messer and G.G. Adams, who I'm sorry I don't know who G.G. Adams is, but I assume he might have been a graduate student. They looked at applying Ledermix as to soothe teeth with apical periodontitis. Root canals were instrumented to the apices, and then a 1% wash of sodium hypochlorite and a 15% EDTA were used. And then once again, they were also using Ledermix paste, calcium hydroxide, or no dressing as their alternatives. And the pain scores were looked at preoperatively and for the next 4 days. And the group with Ledermix had significantly less postoperative pain than calcium hydroxide and the control groups. So the Ledermix group showed significantly less postoperative pain with calcium hydroxide compared with calcium hydroxide and the control group, which was the placebo. Everybody started with higher than average postoperative pain scores, but after 4 hours, the greatest effect was noticed. And after 4 days, the pain level reported with those patients with Ledermix was less, or there was less pain than with the other medicaments. What they concluded was that the rapidity of action was striking, and that Ledermix paste is an effective intracanal medicament for the control of postoperative pain associated with acute apical periodontitis. Now, those of us who've been using it for a long period of time, and I've been using Ledermix since I was introduced to it by Dr. George Hewitt in 1976 know this. We know that it works very effectively. Also, you may not be aware that it is very effective to slow down inflammatory root resorption in teeth that have been traumatized. And here's a study from Pierce and Linthrob in oral surgery, oral medicine, oral pathology from '87, which showed this. Their conclusion was that the antibacterial corticosteroid combination is an effective medication for use in the treatment of progressive root resorption in traumatically injured teeth, which is one reason why the guidelines suggest that the first medicament place should be Ledermix, which is then replaced by calcium hydroxide 3 or 4 days later. So when we look at the antibacterial action of Ledermix, we know that it's limited. It is not as great as calcium hydroxide. It's not as great as Ledermix and calcium hydroxide mixed together. And this is another study from Professor Paul Abbott plus some others, published some time ago. So what are our choices when we're looking at endodontic medicaments? Just to go through it again, we can use a corticosteroid antibiotic, such as Ledermix paste or odonto paste, I suppose, calcium hydroxide, and there's lots of forms of calcium hydroxide around, or we can mix them together. Ledermix and Calcicept paste, etc. paste are popular in some parts. It's something that I've never done a lot of, but we're still going to talk about it. I'm going to tell you how I do my little methods. The 50-50 mix of Ledermix and calcium hydroxide was first used by Schroeder, or first suggested by Schroeder, and has been suggested by him several times later. It's been advocated by Professor Jeffrey Hethersay and also promoted by Professor Paul Abbott. And there's been several research papers on it. You can see them here. These things are all readily available on the internet if you look them up, or if you can't find them, let me know and I'll send them to you. And this is a study looking at this one from the Australian Dental Journal, the Australian Endodontic Journal, which showed that pulp dental Ledermix mixed together had a significantly higher pH than controls and Ledermix itself from day 5 until 10 months, when the Ledermix pulp dent mixture decreased and became similar. Looking at another study, this showed here that mixing different calcium hydroxide formulation with Ledermix gave similar hydroxyl ion release, but the pH and total diffusion was lower than calcium hydroxide alone. Things to take into consideration. Here's another study which shows something similar, something different I should say, the effect of calcium hydroxide on the steroid component of Ledermix and odonto paste. This is a comparison of the two medicaments which are popular in this country. And they showed that adding calcium hydroxide to these pastes reduced the amount of the effect of the clindamycin hydrochloride, and also the declamethylcycline calcium over 7 days were much less over a 7-day period. So let's get back to the 50-50 mix of Ledermix and calcium hydroxide. This does give us a slower release of Ledermix paste components, so the Ledermix dressing, or the dressing, will last longer than a Ledermix paste dressing used by itself. We're suggesting that there's no change in the activity of components, but some people would dispute that. As you can see, there's an increased antibacterial spectrum compared to Ledermix paste used alone. Only a small reduction in pH levels reached in dentine, and lower tissue toxicity compared with calcium hydroxide. And we know that calcium hydroxide, having a pH, quite high pH, does kill cells, but it also stimulates repair of tissues. So in summary, Ledermix materials have been used extensively for almost 58 years. There's research to support their use. Their major functions are, or its major function is, that is anti-inflammatory, its secondary function is anti-resorptive, and a third function, but not so significant, is its antibacterial. Once again, just showing that calcium hydroxide, when added to both materials in this study, showed a rapid destruction in the steroid, but we know we only want the steroid to work probably for the first 4 hours or so, and it's probably not going to be too detrimental in that sort of time frame. So as I said, just to reiterate, these were the concerns of Ledermix, and we know that they're not valid any longer. So when we're using lentulospiral, and many of us use lentulospirals to place our Ledermix and our calcium hydroxide dressings, we have to remember that we shouldn't be using a lentulospiral which is larger than a size 25. We want the lentulospiral to be smaller than the canal preparation. Also, we want to make sure the handpiece is not rotating forward. Oh, sorry, make sure the handpiece is rotating forward. We don't want it rotating anti-clockwise. Otherwise, we end up with these sort of things where we have a Ledermix, we have a lentulo implant and a canal deviation. Also of interest, introduced in 1962 was calcium hydroxide as a possible root canal filling material or medicament period. This was in the New Zealand Dental Journal, also in 1962. So 62 was the year of endodontic medicaments in this part of the world. How do I use my calcium hydroxide? I generally use UltraCal, which is a syringe-based material which I find very easy to inject into root canals. Calcium hydroxide, here's another reason to use rubber dam. We don't want patients swallowing things. If it ends up in someone's stomach, that's good. If it ends up in their lungs, that's not such a good thing. So here we have a small file in someone's lung which has to be removed surgically under a general anaesthetic, and this is not a good thing. If we use rubber dam, we won't have these sort of problems. Here's a patient who's swallowed a 6-unit bridge while having it inserted. There are quite a few people who advocate the use of rubber dam while doing this sort of thing. Here's another reason to use rubber dam. If you look carefully there, you can see a K file. And here it is here. Of course, this had to be removed surgically. Why do we use dam? Because it's much easier than using such things as these endo belts, and then parachutes were suggested many years ago as a substitute for isolation, and that's why there's little holes in the end of files and K files and H files. I'd like to just mention that when we're doing endodontics, we need to have access to illumination and magnification. A microscope is the best way to do this, and microscopes aren't all that expensive these days, but I guess after COVID-19, expenses will be more of a problem for a lot of us. Loops and magnification are best, but you need to have at least a 4.5% magnification, and you need to have a light. Here's a particular brand that I've played around with. Interestingly, there's no light shown here, but certainly we do need to have illumination if we're having magnification. And this is just a clinic from a photograph from our endodontic clinic, or what used to be the endodontic clinic on the 6th floor of Sydney Dental Hospital. And we've got all the bells and whistles there and microscopes being used. And they're not particularly difficult to use, and once you start using a microscope, you'll never want to go back. Just a quick word on access cavities. This is an access cavity done by someone doing some exams, and maybe this was in 2010. Maybe he was well ahead of the bell curve here with his micro access cavities. Just a word on ninja access cavities. When you're doing these sort of things, first of all, make sure you have a pretty good understanding of what you're trying to do. Here's a reference for you to have a look at. This slide was provided to me by my colleague, Dr. Pat Caldwell. When you're doing micro access cavities, you don't want to do this because this defeats the whole purpose. And also I'd just like to mention that you need to have a stop in all your preparations. If you don't have a stop, you won't have a stop. As we said, if you don't have a stop for your preparations, you're going to have a drama, and if you don't have a stop, you need to stop. I'm going to quickly talk about irrigation and activation. This is some work we did many years ago with some student groups looking at irrigant usage. And you can see there that the majority of people were using something related to sodium hypochlorite. Concerningly, there were people who were using bleach. Very few were using commercially prepared solutions, and some were still using local anaesthetic and saline. So what are the ideal irrigants? We don't need to be too concerned. We know what these are. We can look up any endodontic textbook, but let me just say that bleach is not an ideal irrigant. We need to use a pharmaceutical grade product, and it doesn't matter what the concentration is. We've got 1%, 4% and 6%, which is what we're using, and we were using in the endodontic department 1 and 4%. I have colleagues who use 6%, and that's fine, but that's their preference. And here's a 6% one. So as I said, bleach is not suggested as a use as an irrigant. On the back of this bleach box, there's nothing about using it as a endodontic irrigant. Neither is Milton, which is designed to wash out baby bottles and clean down, or was designed to clean down benches and door handles, etc. Just mention quickly E. faecalis. We know it's a gram-positive facultative cocci. It's commonly found in retreatment cases, but it's not effectively killed by calcium hydroxide, and it's susceptible to chlorhexidine. A study here from quite some time ago showed that warming it might make it more effective against E. faecalis. The question is, how does E. faecalis get into root canals? It gets there through poor root fillings with poor coronal seals, and that's because E. faecalis comes in many processed foods like sausages, processed meats, and hard rind cheeses. This is the mechanism of calcium hydroxide, the mechanism of chlorhexidine, how it kills cells. This is a slide we used to use with the students, and I'm sure they still do. This slide design was from my colleague Michelle Heffernan, going through what the medicaments, or what the irrigants use, or what the irrigants do, I should say, I'm sorry, and how they work. Some time ago, I had some honours students looking at irrigation times, and they did a literature review, and they showed that really we need to use irrigants for a lot longer than we think we do, and that some single irrigants may not be sufficient to completely sterilise root canals, but with a combination there's often an improved result. And that's just looking at how long we should use irrigants in root canals for, and you can see there a lot longer than the time that many of us use them for. And just going through some studies on what the various irrigants do and for how long they use them for. Interesting reading. So in other words, if you're just placing irrigant in a root canal and then sucking it out with your high-speed sucker or your endodontic sucker, and you're only using a 5 ml syringe and that's all you're doing, you're not doing enough. So I would suggest that you need to use a larger volume syringe, and we use 10 ml syringes. We use 5 for some, and we use 3 ml syringes for our solvents. Also, I would suggest that you use a Luer-Lock syringe and that you use a bib for your patients. Use lots and lots of irrigation. As I said, it's cheap as chips. When we're thinking of irrigation, don't think of the Bridal Veil Falls in the Blue Mountains, but think of the Horseshoe Falls in Niagara on the Canadian side. Maybe you should consider using a smaller needle. The 30 gauge needles are probably the best. They need to be side vented, and they should hopefully be flexible. Remember that your needle needs to be smaller than the canal you're trying to irrigate, and it should not bind in the canal. Here's a device that's just recently come on the market, which I find quite useful. It is a sonic-powered endodontic irrigation device. Plastic tip, disposable, with a 25 taper. A 25 size tip size and an 06 taper. This is an interesting diagram because it's from VDW, and it shows that the irrigant should be placed to the top of the canal and the orifice preparation, not just in the canal. You need to have lots of irrigation. As a colleague of mine used to say, and a teacher of endodontics, Dr. Tony Martin, when you're thinking of irrigation, think of torrential downfalls, don't think of summer gentle rains. The problem with the eddy is that you only can use it on some hand scalers. It doesn't fit all. I'm sure this will be sorted out in the future. How does it work? It operates at 5,000 to 6,000 hertz on an air-driven handpiece. It's single use. You use it once and throw it out. It's got a polyamide tip. I have known of them to break though, but very infrequently. I've only ever known of one. It produces both cavitation and acoustic streaming, and it should help you clean out isthmi, fins, cul-de-sacs, etc. But to have best results, you must have a prep that's at least 2506. And of course, you don't place it too far into the canal. You just place it in the orifice. It looks a very promising system. And ultrasonic energy, we know, disrupts biofilm, and this will lead to the removal of dentinal debris, improves irrigant penetration, it will reduce bacterial numbers and leads to improved root fills. This is a developer, Winifred Zeffenfeld. Quickly talking about rotary preparation systems. It doesn't matter what you use, just use a system that you like, but I would suggest that you want one that's minimally tapered, flexible, simple, and has matching gutter perker points. Anything's better than hand filing, in my opinion. 4 and 5% taper are now regarded as ideal, and I'm going to very briefly mention some systems here, which I've got here, quickly go through them. When you're using any rotary or reciprocating preparation system, you need to have excellent access. And that needs to be to the chamber and to the orifice. You need to know how the system works, and you need to know when it won't work. You need to use rubber dam without exception, and of course that goes without saying now. In a COVID-19 world, we need to use rubber dam for everything. We need copious irrigation, as I said, lots and lots of it, and we need to have good radiographic technique. As we said, know your system, use magnification and illumination, use lots of irrigation and condense it well. And if you're using hot gutter perker techniques, you may want to think about using a heat stable cement. There's only one on the market that I'm aware of. For preparation success, I would suggest you don't stop rotary or reciprocating files in the canal. Use plenty of irrigant, at least 40 mils. Clean the flutes of debris using a soaked sponge between passage into the canals, and don't reuse files. Remember, no stopping. Before we pick up a rotary or reciprocating file system, we need to have a glide path prepared. We need to have hand files. We can do it with hand files, and I still do use hand files, or I still did. We can use ARP Pilot, which is a reciprocating system, Pro Glider, or the Wave 1 Gold Glider. Quickly going to talk about the ARP Pilot system, because this is the one I've got the most experience with. It's a reciprocating glide path file system. It's a one size 12.5. It's an M wire. It's got a constant taper of 4%, and you use it once and throw it out. Once again, it's got the same cross section as all VDW instruments. Quickly going to talk about the Reciproc Blue file, which is the one I've had the most experience with. There's only 3 files in this system. The interesting thing about it is the first 4 millimeters have a different taper to the rest of the file, except for the 50, which is a standard 5% taper. Now, what does this do? Well, I'll mention that in a minute. All these files from VDW have a 16 millimeter active length, which means that they're sometimes a bit easy to use in tight spaces. As we said, with the Reciproc Blue system, there's only 3 files, the 25, the 40, and the 50. And it's the 4 millimeters of taper that does all the work. In fact, some could say that you only need to use 1 file. Well, this is stretching the truth a little, because you do need to get your glide path sorted out first of all. But you can do a lot of the preparation with only 1 file, which I'm just about to talk about. All the 3 VDW systems on the market have a non-cutting tip and this S-shaped cross-section, which appears to be very effective at debris removal. This is comparing the M2 25 with the Reciproc 25. And you can see the more bulgy one is the reciproc 25. And you can see in the first 4 millimeters that it is opening up the apical 4 millimeters of the canal much more than the M25 does. And looking again at the other files in the system, and just looking here, we just need to remember that we need to get a canal to a 35 at least for irrigants to reach the apical third. And when we make the canal prep a little bit bigger, we get a better increase in irrigant volume. And this is some information that I've borrowed from my colleague Peter Parashos in Melbourne and modified it slightly. So remember that morphologically, most apical constrictions are a 30 to a 45 in that size range, and a reciproc 25 file will do preparations to that size in the first 4 millimeters or so, comparing it to other files in the M2. Now this is an interesting slide because it just shows you how much difference there is between 4 and 6% and 2% tapers. And 2% taper, as you remember, is the ISO standard. Particularly when we get up to D10 and D14, there's an awful lot of tooth structure removed, and that's why now there's been this concern about the removal of cervical dentine and what it does to the strength of teeth. When we look at the reciproc 25 and 40 and 50, we can see we have in some ways a similar sorts of problem, but not as significant. And when we compare the reciproc 25 to the M2 35 and the reciproc 40, you can see there's also some things we need to keep in mind there. Now the VDW Rotate is a new file system on the market. You can look through this yourself and get some information if you like, but it's basically a modified M2 file system in a much more flexible material. It's the same metallurgy as the reciproc blue, which is a very flexible file system. And in this system here, you've got a 1504 opening file, then followed by a 2005, and then you can use the 2506, which I wouldn't personally do. I would be using the 2504 because I have this concern about the amount of tooth structure you're going to remove with greater tapers. And this is just a basic file system. And going through, once again, they're showing that it would be good, and they're recommending that you have a C pilot 10 first of all to make sure that the canal is work out how difficult it's going to be, and then we prepare our glide path, and then we go from there. I wouldn't be suggesting that we use the 06 tapered files myself. I'd be sticking to the 04 tapers. This is an interesting file system, and perhaps you should contact people and have a look at it if you have some interest. Can you tell the 4% from the 6% taper? Well, you can if you look at the number of striations on the shank. 4% one stripe and 6% 3. All these systems have a obtura sort of hot gutter perker technique file system, filling system, which I don't particularly like. But also on the right-hand side of this slide is a file verifier, which will verify your preparation for you. And I think these are very useful instruments, and I was using these when I was more clinically active than I am now. Suggesting that you can create your own file sequence if you want to. I'm not too sure why you'd want to do that, but as I said, I would shy away from the greater tapers and stick to the 04 tapers to do your preparations. Once again, just looking at the tapers of these file systems. Okay, so the VDW Rotate system is basically a more flexible file system. It has a hand file. We need to, and we should be using hand files between all the files we're using. We can choose an 04 or an 06 if we wish, and this is going through the system. And they have matching paper points and gutter perker. I only could find one file or one article on this particular system, and that's probably because it's very new on the market, and it showed that the Rotate had a better resistance to cyclic fatigue than some other file systems on the market. The True Anatomy system is another system I think is worthy of your attention. This is from Dentsply Sirona, and this is basically a file system which uses, once again, a file to open up the orifice, and then you can pick to get to a 2504, it's actually a 2604. And once again, this has matching GP and paper points, and perhaps you may think that matched paper points are a waste of time. No, they're not. They save you a lot of time. And matched gutter-perker points save an awful lot of frustration. When we're measuring working length, make sure we know where we're measuring to. We want to be measuring a millimetre or so from the apical constriction, which we think is there in place. And remember, if we have apical resorption, we need to be in sound tooth structure. And here's some articles on apical constrictions. When using electronic apical locators, I think you need to have a radiograph at least once. You need to ensure the canal is dry. You want to match the canal and instrument diameter. You want to pass the file through the constriction first and then pull it back. And I've got to say that most electronic apex locators are pretty accurate. When you're using a motor, choose one that you can change systems if you decide you don't like one. Here's a couple on the market which will allow you to do that. And you want one that's got a library of current rotary systems and can be updated. The X-Smart Plus motor is quite a small little motor, doesn't take up too much room. The VDW Gold has an apex locator built into it, takes up a bit more space on your desk. So what are we preparing our canals to? Depends on the tooth, depends on the patient's age. It depends on, based on anatomical studies these are coming from, and we're suggesting maybe a size 30 would be good, and we want to keep taper to a minimum, possibly 5%. But as we just said, apical diameter is at least 350 to 400 mu, so therefore our prep should be perhaps 35 to 40. When we're looking at apical considerations, we want the irrigants to reach the apical zone. We need a canal that's prepared to at least a 30 to a 35. Remember, constrictions are hardly ever round, and they're more likely to be oval or ribbon shaped. Root filling points, remember, or matched GP points, all the systems I mentioned have those. Just quickly going through this, we're running out of time a little, but matched paper points and gutter-perker points are very handy. If you have some problems, maybe you want to consider using hydraulic calcium silicate cements. I'm very big on the use of biodentine, and we can use those to prepare procedural accidents. And here we're looking at preparing a strip perforation, and this is a very forgiving material. We can fill canals, we can use them for apical plugs, and here's a case where we used it for an apical plug, and some 24 months later. We can use them to repair dentogenic defects, and this is where we used to extract teeth and place them back again. This is an interesting material because you can pack it against the PDL and it doesn't cause too many problems. You can use it to fill unusual anatomies. You can use it in external resorptive cases after you've used some trichloroacetic acid. You can use it for resorptive defects, once again using trichloroacetic acid and perhaps Ledermix. You can use it to fill large apices and to get resorptive defects filled, and also long-term calcium hydroxide replacement. And here's just some cases where we've placed a long-term, or placed biodentine and then backfilled against it, with some cases from the dental hospital. And here's one of the cases I just showed you. This is the apical closure 5 years later. We can also use it in pulpotomies. Haven't got time to really go through this, but this is how you do it. I feel that whatever you can do with MTA, and look, don't get me wrong, MTA is a wonderful material, but I find it very hard to use. Setting time is a problem, but you can do things more easily with biodentine. How do we place it? There's messing gun sort of things, plastics, all these sort of things are available to you. And as with placing MTA, you can use the same materials. Just remember that you have to clean these guns out. You can use the cheaper sort of little devices as well. They're quite handy. Some people have suggested you could use disposable MTA carriers, or you could use cheap amalgam guns, but I think that's rather difficult. Remember that you're going to need to use a plugger of some form. Doesn't matter what sort you use, there's lots on the market. Find one that you like. I've found the Glick plastic very useful. And these little plastics, the 212s and the 179s. Perhaps you can use the larger paper points. Micro brushes are also useful. You can use large diameter K-files, doesn't matter who makes them. Restoration of teeth, you should restore teeth as soon as possible. Perhaps place a band and tooth seal temporary. A lot of people don't like placing bands. I've got one on my tooth at present that fractured, and I must say it's very annoying. You've got to keep it really clean, which is difficult for an older person. And this is just preparing a tooth. With this sort of tooth, we'll probably end up with a band around it. Nice preparation there. This sort of case. And root fills and posts. People don't use posts too much these days. I wouldn't suggest that they're necessary. Remember, you need to cusp cap all molars unless you want this to happen to you, and this is very embarrassing if it happens to be your dental nurse. Remember that if you don't cusp cap, expect to have root fractures. And consider amalgams. Why not use amalgam? It's a good material. This is from my colleague Warwick Hardy. Nice. When you were dealing with acute abscesses, remember that we need to drain any pus, and this may take some time, and you need to do it on isolation. Don't just give antibiotics. Adequately temporize the tooth. Don't leave the tooth open. You need lots of irrigation and a small file beyond the apical constriction. Use Ledermix and calcium hydroxide dressings, but I wouldn't suggest mixing them together. And you need to see the patient within 4 days, and perhaps ring them the next day. I would ring them next day as well, and then re-irrigate at 4 days and then place calcium hydroxide. This is looking at corticosteroids and pain relief, and this is just going through a paper where they only found 18 which they looked at, and they found that Ledermix paste, once as Effie Ehrman did, is effective as a intracanal medicament for controlling postoperative pain. Remember, you can suck out pus using some positive aspiration. It's always good. Pus and blood, it impresses patients. Remember, never let the sun go down on undrained pus. Also, remember to restore teeth as soon as possible. This doesn't mean glass on and cement. Here's an article you can look up which goes through why you might have patients coming back with pain in between treatments. And looking through this nanomic, you can have a look at this for yourself. This is a very worthwhile read just recently in Dental Australian Prescriber, looking at management of dental pain in primary care. Some other useful references on looking after or looking for pain and the use of antibiotics. You should have a look at these. Dealing with hypochlorite accidents, I wouldn't suggest that you inject this material because you get this sort of thing and patients don't like it, and it becomes very problematic. You'll only generally get a hypo accident if there's a perforation present. In routine cases, you shouldn't. You want to avoid needles binding in the canal. You want to activate your solution, and you use TGA-approved irrigants, if only to protect yourself medico-legally. Here's a little article you could have a look up. It's from Dental Update from many years ago on me talking about sodium hypochlorite. This is when I was much younger and didn't have ears. I would suggest that you may wish to join the Australian Society of Endodontology. It's always been supportive of dental education, and it's not just for specialists, so join it today. Here's some Instagram effects you may like to follow, accounts you may like to follow, some of my friends there. And I'd like to thank you for your attention. You can contact me on these if you like. And once again, we will go to some questions now. We've got a little bit of time for questions, if there are any. There may be none, if I'm lucky. From Claire Straker, great to see you, Prof. Oh, yes. There's no questions here. They're just people passing me money. Yes, someone's asked, does cause discoloration of restored tooth? Yes, it does, but that's only if you leave it in the coronal part of the tooth. And the whole idea is, am I meant to tick this, aren't I? Yes. Okay, I would like to answer this question live, and I would say, yes, it will discolor teeth if you put it in the coronal part of the chamber, but you have to make sure that it's not. You only put it in the canal, and you can use micro brushes, etc. if you happen to inadvertently get some in the coronal part, so that it won't discolor teeth. Please explain about how you use Ledermix calcium hydroxide. Okay, yes, truth. Sorry, there was a technical. How do I use Ledermix paste and calcium hydroxide, I've been asked. Well, I place the Ledermix paste apically, and then I just inject in using a syringe the calcium hydroxide, and I'm using ultracal, which is a very easily injectable material. Okay, Roger's asked the same thing. Someone's asked, is there much difference between sonic and ultrasonic activation? Yes. The devices like as I was talking about, are very effective and are much more effective than other methods, I feel, of activating your solution. I don't think there are any contraindications to Ledermix use. Unless you've got a patient, I suppose there's been that one case of a patient who had a hypersensitivity to it, but I think that's very, very rare. Very, very rare. What is your stay on single visits endodontics? What is my stay on it? Well, I wouldn't stay on it again. I'm not big on single visit endodontics because I just think it negates the effect of calcium hydroxide in canals, and I think calcium hydroxide is a particularly useful material. I certainly wouldn't use it as a patient in pain. I just think that to do a good job in less time, for me, is much more difficult. Maybe younger guys are doing it. I know a lot of younger guys are, and girls for that matter. I shouldn't use that as just a single male thing, should I? But I don't particularly like the idea because you don't get the effect of calcium hydroxide in the canals. That's one reason why, if you are going to do single visit endodontics, you need to use a 6% irrigant, you need to activate it, you need to use lots of it, and you need to use a system that you're very capable at using because you only get one go at it, and if it goes wrong, it's a problem. How long do you leave an intracanal medicament before obturation? Well, it depends on other symptoms as well. Perhaps I would suggest 2 or 3 weeks, depending on what you're doing. Sometimes patients go overseas. If you're going to go overseas, remember that the patients are going overseas, or if you're going overseas too, but no one's going overseas at present, you need a double seal temporary, that's calcium hydroxide, beg your pardon, Cavit and GIC of some form, or composite resin. I would suggest no more than 4 weeks before I fill it, because calcium hydroxide becomes inactivated itself after a while. But 4 weeks is a good time, I would think. How should we use biodentine to perform pulpotomy? I've just mentioned that very briefly. I've only ever done it a couple of times. I can get the information sent to you if you'd like. It's a very good material and it's very easy to use. Someone's sending me more money. Thank you very much. That's very nice of you. Any more questions? Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left to fill in the evening. But I can't get the questions up. So if there are questions here that we haven't got to, and there are quite a few, we will get these answered for you, and apparently we might do a little question and answer section where you ask, I read the questions and then I provide the answers. This is good because it allows me to find the information if I don't have it on the top of my head. So it's sort of cheating, isn't it? But that's probably just how I am, eh? I'm just, I apologise for my COVID-19 hairstyle, but I was going to cut my hair myself. My grandson cut his hair himself this evening, causing quite a commotion, but it wouldn't really matter with me. But when you're 3.5, probably not a good idea to use your craft scissors to cut your hair. Thank you very much for the kind words people have said. That's very nice of you. Yes, it's interesting. Just answering Shireen Mustafa's the last one. Using calcium hydroxide Ledermix, no synergistic effect. No, I'm not suggesting that they will. I think they don't necessarily work any better. It's just that they carry out two functions in one. That's a paper that I did mention, I thought. I just find that the Ledermix first, and the calcium hydroxide. Remember, I was working, or you may not know, I was working with public patients, and they sometimes wouldn't come back when they're out of pain. If you just have Ledermix in there, you have you'll have nothing in the canal after 4 days. And I think it's just better to be stay safe and to have some calcium hydroxide as well. So I'm not expecting them to make each other. I just expect them to do their own job. I don't mix them together. I just use them separately, but in the same canal. Okay, well, I think that's the end of everything. And I do thank you very much for your attention. You will be given, you'll get a statement of attendance, and we will be sending out the PDF of the presentation if you would like it, and I'm sure you all will want it. So I'd like to thank you for your attendance, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much for joining me this evening. I hope you enjoyed my background, and you might like to ask me what it is at some stage. Thank you very much. Good night now.